In 1988, AIDS activists rallied at the headquarters of the Food and Drug Administration near Washington, D.C. The world had been holding its breath for an AIDS drug for 6 years since the World Health Organization formally recognized the epidemic. At the time, researchers at the National Cancer Institute had already discovered AZT, a drug still used today in the treatment of HIV infections. The 1988 protesters questioned why the FDA was taking so long to approve new AIDS drugs and called it the single most incomprehensible bottleneck in American bureaucratic history. How did the FDA gain so much authority? History shows that public opinion was the most crucial factor in the development of the FDA's regulatory power. The beginnings of the FDA go back to the early 20th century, when muckraking journalists encouraged the public to support increased federal regulation. Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, revealed in 1906 the unsanitary conditions of the meatpacking industry to the horror of the American public. That year, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. This law gave the Bureau of Chemistry, later renamed the FDA, the responsibility to inspect for the adulteration and misbranding of medications and food. Clearly, public concern for consumer health played a key role in the founding of the FDA. But at the time, safety testing was still not legally required. That changed with further outcries of public opinion. A popular 1933 book titled 100 Million Guinea Pigs convinced Americans that they were merely test subjects for the side effects and potency of patent drugs. 4 years later, the S.E. Massengill Company unknowingly dissolved an antibiotic in a poisonous solvent, diethylene glycol, and sold it across the country. Over 100 Americans died after using the so-called elixir sulfanilamide. The ensuing public outrage pushed Congress to pass the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. This law required drug companies to submit data to the FDA from preliminary safety tests on animals. Only after federal approval could these drugs be legally manufactured and sold. Clearly, public opinion about consumer safety further empowered the FDA with legal and scientific authority. But by 1959, American drug companies were still marketing new medications of unproven efficacy at exorbitantly high prices. Congressional hearings to further expand FDA regulatory powers were challenged by corporate opposition. No drug manufacturer liked the idea of a sole authority with the power to approve or reject all new pharmaceutical products. Meanwhile, in Europe, a new wonder drug was emerging. A German firm had launched thalidomide as a treatment for allergies, colds, coughs, headaches, insomnia, and morning sickness. When the Richardson Merrill Company requested to market the drug in the U.S., FDA reviewer Dr. Francis Oldham Kelsey rejected the application 6 times, citing the 1938 FD&C Act and the dearth of safety evidence. Since clinical trials were still unregulated, Merrill was able to distribute an estimated 2.5 million pills in the U.S. for testing purposes. Sadly, scientists discovered in 1961 that pregnant women taking thalidomide had given birth to over 10,000 babies worldwide, with defects primarily of the limbs but also of many internal organs. Public outrage over these thalidomide babies prompted Congress to hold more hearings to discuss FDA authority. Advised by Dr. Louis Lasagna, Congress passed an amendment to the FD&C Act regarding the new drug application. In addition to preliminary animal safety tests, pharmaceutical companies were now required to assess the efficacy of new drugs in an extensive multi-year clinical trial process involving 4 lengthy phases. But FDA protection of Americans from harmful drugs came at a price. Nearly 30 years after the 1962 amendment, Dr. Lasagna reported that thousands of lives are claimed each year as a result of delays in FDA approval for cancer and AIDS drugs. In response to the public protests of the late 80s, the FDA developed a fast-track accelerated approval program for drugs targeting life-threatening and otherwise untreatable medical conditions. Before the system, it took new drugs an average of 12 years to go from the lab to the pharmacy. In contrast, the fast-track program's first AIDS drug, AZT, took less than 2 years for FDA approval. In this instance, public opinion about AIDS helped reduce the FDA's regulatory power. When would accusations of underregulation again clash with concerns of overregulation? In 2006, the FDA's Fast Track program approved thalidomide as a treatment for multiple myeloma. Remembering the thalidomide baby tragedy nearly 50 years ago, the public and media began to stir with concern. Fast-track drugs for cancer are increasingly recalled or withdrawn from the market for inefficacy or dangerous side effects. Many people now argue that some FDA scientific standards are too low. Will the government respond? Nobody can tell now, but as history has shown, what will certainly matter most is public opinion.